My fellow Americans, welcome to the Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing John Ford's 1939 Young Mr. Lincoln.
Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am.
A great American actor.
I've been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature.
A great American filmmaker.
My politics are short and sweet.
A great American man.
If elected, I shall be thankful.
Young Mr. Lincoln. It's an American movie classic.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who always has a blowout party for Lincoln's birthday. Jim, what do you have planned this year? The usual rail splitting contest?
No, I'm going to celebrate by taking my entire jug full of Lincoln head pennies and bury them in my backyard before Elon Musk comes and confiscates them.
Okay.
Because supposedly he's going to get rid of the penny. And that's one of the ways that we keep the Lincoln legacy alive.
Well, I'm in favor of getting rid of the Lincoln penny, I have to say. Let's go to the nickels and then let's get rid of the $1 bills while we're at it.
How are you going to celebrate?
Well, I think the way that people should celebrate is to watch Young Mr. Lincoln. It's a good lesson in Lincoln. So
I agree with that. I would also say that what I'd like to see is that people resume celebrating Lincoln's birthday on Lincoln's birthday, which is February 12th. And I don't know about your schooling when you grew up, but in grade school, that was the holiday. We had the day off on February 12th, whether it fell on any day of the week. And if it was on a weekend, then no day off. And I'd like to see that. You know, I know that people love these 3-day weekends and the labor unions negotiate for them and such, but, you know, we ought to celebrate Lincoln on February 12th, Washington on February 22nd, and Martin Luther King, we ought to celebrate on his birthday, January 15th, and really honor these three people. Those are the only three people, except for Jesus Christ, that we celebrate on the actual, their actual birthdays by name.
When I was growing up, we did not have February 12th off. We only had Washington's birthday off.
Oh, okay.
So I'm surprised you had a very, or maybe extremely patriotic school system that you went to.
Or Northern.
But yeah, I'm sure they don't have it off down the South. I always would like to know when I can go buy a mattress. So let's celebrate these birthdays. Anyway, so I'm just going to say that Young Mr. Lincoln comes from the period of classic Hollywood filmmaking and was directed by John Ford, who is considered by many, or maybe not so much anymore, but used to be considered the greatest American director. Jim, John Ford is one of ours. He's one of the leading voices for conservatism in Hollywood. Do you have an opinion about John Ford as a movie maker?
Yes, and I don't have opinions about many directors, but I do about him. He was really a remarkable figure, not just in filmmaking. Some say he was the first film auteur, so to speak, but that doesn't mean artsy-fartsy. He specialized in Westerns, which almost by definition is a man's world, but focused his other films on topics far beyond the Western. He's kind of a Hemingway-esque figure to me. You know, tough exterior, tough and macho on the outside, but sensitive on the inside. And what do you think of him?
You know, I like John Ford. I like that he's a very good director in the sense of getting beautiful pictures and all of that. You know, I like his Westerns, The Searchers, Stagecoach, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. He's Irish, so he's made a couple of good Irish movies too, The Quiet Man and The Informer. You know, he's probably done as much as anyone in Hollywood to shape Americans' vision of itself in the 20th century. The politics, you know, apparently he was a staunch conservative. It's not immediately obvious on the screen. His Westerns are often sympathetic to the Indians, and there are others like the Grapes of Wrath that take the side of the downtrodden. So, well, and anyway, I mean, what do you think about the politics of his movies?
Yeah, I think it's subtle. I mean, he's obviously, especially this movie we're going to be talking about, is into enhancing the myths of America. And the thing about myths is they can be true.
Right.
Just because something's a myth doesn't mean it's a lie. And so I think you see it more in the Americana rather than taking a side in any partisan sense. He was um, he was a personally courageous man as well, getting right in the thick of the action in World War II, even though he was in his mid 40s. He was on site at the Battle of the Midway and got
Yeah.
wounded by Japanese strafing. He landed a day or so after D-Day on the Normandy beaches. He filmed the Holocaust, the concentration camps, and he became a key advisor to William Donovan, who was the father of the OSS, the secret, the CIA. So really kind of a remarkable figure. He wasn't always good to actors, probably a little bit better than Alfred Hitchcock. Um, he was a notorious drunk.
Right.
He had drinking spells, but didn't seem to have it interfere with his work. Seemed to me to be a very efficient and quick filmmaker, too. It was no nonsense.
Yeah, and his movies are full of masculine nostalgia and sympathy for the little guy, and a belief that there's an honor code we should live
Yeah.
by. And then, since so many of his movies were set in the past, he did help create the American myth, the Manifest Destiny, and a myth of American greatness, and not well, actually, the truth of American greatness. He's very closely associated with another Hollywood conservative, John Wayne. They made
Yes.
14 movies together. And of course, he made some movies with quite a few movies with Henry Fonda, including today's movie. There were six of them. And Fonda was a famous, well-known Hollywood liberal. He
And
was,
then and eventually had a falling out.
yeah,
There's this famous story during the making of Mr. Roberts, I think it was, where Ford actually punched out Henry Fonda, and they that sort of ruined their relationship.
yeah, I can see how that would happen.
Yeah, but Fonda was Fonda, who plays Abe Lincoln here, was a staunch Democrat, but he also, along with Jimmy Stewart, his best friend, sort of created this model of how a staunch liberal like Fonda and a staunch conservative like Jimmy Stewart could nonetheless be friends. And it was very simple. We don't talk politics.
Right.
We talked about everything else.
Well, and also, I don't. Do you ever see The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance?
I did. I did.
We probably saw it together in college. I
Yeah.
mean, that's because that's where I saw it. Well, the most famous line in that is when legend becomes fact, print the legend. This is remarkably self-aware from the filmmaker who is one of the great American myth makers, especially when it comes to the frontier.
Right. Right. I liked also a non-Western called The Last Hurrah. It's a 1958 film starring Spencer Tracy. And it was basically about local political bosses and corruption and all that. And that's a very good non-Western movie of his from the later years.
Let me do a summary of the movie so we can get to the matter at hand here. By the way, this summary does have spoilers, so if you don't want to hear the spoilers, jump ahead for about 2 minutes. Young Mr. Lincoln opens in 1832 with 20-year-old Abe Lincoln running a general store in the frontier town of Salem, Illinois. He trades some groceries to a broke pioneer family in exchange for a barrel of books, including some law books, which gets him thinking about pursuing a legal career. Later, we see him awkwardly in love with Anne Rutledge, a local girl who encourages him to become a lawyer. Alas, she dies, but becomes immortalized throughout American history as Abraham Lincoln's one true love. Understandably, he's very morose about this, but decides to pull himself together and become the man and the lawyer that poor dead Anne always imagined he'd be. We skip ahead to 1837 and see Abe riding a donkey into the town of Springfield, Illinois, where he sets up a legal practice. He's very popular because he's physically strong and tells funny stories. During a raucous Independence Day celebration, two brothers get into a fight with a drunk, obnoxious ruffian, and when his friend comes to his aid, it is discovered that the ruffian has been stabbed to death. The brothers are charged with murder and almost lynched, but Abe heads off the mob. At the murder trial, he saves them again by securing a not guilty verdict. the deceased friend had testified that he'd seen which of the brothers had done the stabbing. But Abe saves the day when he points to an almanac that says the moon wasn't bright enough for him to have witnessed the fight. At which point, the friend confesses that he'd stabbed him, just like on Perry Mason. There's a subplot involving Abe's courtship of Mary Todd and his romantic and political rivalry with the more polished and successful Stephen A. Douglas, which, for the sake of brevity and also because it's not really germane to the story, I will not elaborate upon here. And that's the summary.
I'm glad you mentioned the Perry Mason moment. There was also a Columbo moment, the
Oh,
sort of, oh, one more thing. I got, setting up the gotcha um, exposure at the end of the
right,
trial. So
right.
yeah, that's good.
Yeah. No Beatles references that I could come up with, and
Oh,
no.
I've got one, but I'll save it
Okay, we'll
for
save it for the right time. Okay.
yeah.
In terms of how it was received, it's very difficult to get good box office numbers from the 1930s, but it was well received with good reviews and had an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay. And it's still highly regarded today, was selected by the Library of Congress in 2003 for preservation in the United States National Film Registry as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant.
Well, it's what's amazing to me. This movie came out in 1939. Think about for a second what also came out in 1939. Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and more. And if you look at Ford specifically, how does anyone churn out in just 1 year Young Mr. Lincoln, Stagecoach, and Drums Along the Mohawk? And then within 3 years of those, there's those films, plus Grapes of Wrath and How Green Was My Valley. I mean, it's incredible output. And the output reminds me of the Beatles.
Okay.
And considering what they did in just 11 months with the Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver albums, and not to mention what they did in just 6 to 7 years. My issue is always, why does everything take so long today in pop culture? I mean, technology and communications and distribution wheels supposed to make things faster. Instead, we've everything seems to take forever between albums, or we have to wait 5 years or more for a new James Bond film. So I mean, the output of these old-fashioned people way back when is just incredible. And Ford was at the head of this.
I will say that first of all, Ford was operating within the Hollywood system, which was a factory. So it wasn't. I mean, he had a lot of help in keeping things going fast. But you're right. It is still remarkable that he was able to do those three films in 1939. And I will also say that Steven Spielberg does have the talent and ability to get these. I mean, he churns movies out too. I mean, really,
Yeah.
it can be done. But a lot of times these are really people who take themselves very serious as artists. I mean, it takes them a long time to do it.
Yeah, and probably to get the financing together, there
Right,
usually there has to be a teaming up of 5 or 6 different production outfits.
right.
So I understand it, but it's sort of ironic that that it
Well,
takes so long now compared to the way it used to take.
so Jim, who would you recommend this movie to?
Well, I think I'd recommend it to anyone who thinks like we do that Lincoln was our best president
Hmm.
and would like to see a positive portrayal with some insights as to his humble beginnings and the personal qualities that help explain his greatness later on. It's a hagiographic film, though the less stellar qualities of Lincoln, and especially of the period in which the movie was made, are there to see if you're willing to look for them. And
Okay.
I'd also say that you have to like old fashioned movies
Yeah.
and black and white with lots of intrusive background music as people are talking. Um, Audiences who can put their modernity aside for a couple hours and enjoy an old fashioned movie are going to like this. On the flip side, if you don't, you won't.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true. I would say what I recommended too is pretty much what you said. I mean, history buffs, Lincoln lovers, and also John Ford enthusiasts who want to, you know,
Yeah.
want to be completist about it. Okay, so what did you like about the movie?
Well, I'm always a sucker for crime and courtroom dramas.
Right.
So just the fact that, that's was half the movie. And it's really two movies in one. You've got the whole exploration of Lincoln's qualities and his relationships and et cetera. And then you have the crime and the courtroom drama. And so I really like that about the movie. I thought both parts were well done.
I was also going to say that I did enjoy. I always enjoy a good courtroom drama where one of the attorneys pulls a rabbit out of the hat. So yes, I like that part too.
Yeah, yeah,
It's I guess we should specify too that Lincoln is like 25, 26 years old in this movie. Very, I mean, it's right there in the title, Young Mr. Lincoln, and he's definitely a young guy here. I
yeah.
would say also that I like the non-cynical depiction of Lincoln. It wasn't I wasn't made to feel guilty for admiring this young, ambitious, and decent man, and I like that.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this. I think there was just one moment in the whole movie where he did something underhanded.
Yeah,
And that's when to win the tug of war rope pull at the 4th of July celebration, he put his team's loop at the end of the rope around the horse and buggy and got the horse and buggy to move and carry his team to victory, which was patently dishonest.
right,
And
right.
it's just interesting that that was slipped in there
Yeah, I
sideways.
agree. I couldn't understand what
Yeah,
was going on there. It was almost like he was being a scamp or something,
yeah,
but he's a little old to be a scamp. And
yeah. I thought
and
that was just that intrigued me,
yeah,
and maybe it harkens. I wouldn't read too much into this, but harkens to some of the expediency that Lincoln took, steps he took later on as president and whatnot. I thought the movie had a good mix of humor and drama.
yeah,
At some points, it was very lighthearted, and other times it was dark. And I like that. It kept things moving.
the movie.
Well, one more thing I liked, and I
Okay.
referenced it when I talked about Ford. I like the efficiency of the storytelling.
Yeah,
I mean, if you think about near the opening of the movie, in one brisk sequence, we see Lincoln reading a book under a tree. We see him falling in love with Anne Rutledge when she approaches him while he's reading. Then we see, and they fall in love by the river. Then we see the river turn angry with ice and stormy water flowing down, and she's dead. And then we
right,
see him by her tombstone, and then we see him talking to her, so to speak, playing the game with the stick. If the stick falls one way, I will go into law, and going into law. And all of that happened literally in like 2 minutes and without much dialogue. And so I really liked how he moved the story at various points along in a very efficient but totally comprehensible manner.
yeah. No, I mean, in the old days, they used to be able to well, the movie's only 95 minutes long or something. It just goes right. You're right. It goes by fast. And of course, back then they used to have two movies. You'd go to the movies and see two movies. So they need
Yes.
short. All right. So didn't like,
I thought the undertow of the music got too much for me at times, especially the sentimental lovey-dovey type scenes where you had these really the string section playing underneath the dialogue as Lincoln and Anne Rutledge were, you know, cooing to each other. Some of that really sort of, even for someone like me who likes old-fashioned movies, I said this is too sappy, too much, too sentimental at some points.
well, this kind of goes to the point you were making earlier, which is that the movie was made in 1939 and it looks and feels like it. I mean, it's so respectful that it feels outdated in a way that other movies from the 1930s don't. I mean, movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Gone with the Wind, My Girl Friday, and The Awful Truth. I mean, those movies still feel as fresh and entertaining today as they did back then. So,
Yeah.
um,
What
uh,
didn't you like?
I didn't like the central tension in the trial. You know, each brother apparently thinks the other one stabbed the guy, so they each try to claim they did it to get the other one off. I mean, they've been in jail for like 6 weeks or something together, or, they've been
They
together and none of them said, like, I didn't do it. Why did you stab him? And, they
they could
don't,
have worked it out and come up with a cover story like the Melendez brothers or something.
well, the thing is, they didn't stab him, but
Right.
neither of them stabbed him, and neither of them told the other one, I didn't stab him. Well, I didn't. That would have taken like a 1 minute conversation. So I didn't like that. And then the mother claims that she saw who did the stabbing, but she won't say who it was because she doesn't want to have to do this Sophie's Choice thing where she's going to decide which of her sons lives or dies. So this is all premised on the idea that like no one in this family, you know,
Talks to each
talks about
other.
talks about the thing that they're all on trial. Like two of them are going to die or something, and no one actually talks about it. And
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that because I
and
was
then
just
mom is not a,
loving
she.
loving the humor of the trial and all that.
I mean, considering that this is a murder trial, the mom is not really a very helpful witness. She tells the jury she knows which one did the stabbing, but she won't tell. It's like how do you know who did the stabbing because neither of them did it? I mean, so I didn't like that. I mean, I just thought that was a little much.
Yeah, I also thought that I didn't totally buy the some of the more obvious psychoanalyzing of
Yeah,
Lincoln that was in the film.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, he didn't hit us over the head with it exactly, but this idea that coming back to the link is linked together his death of his own mother and death of his would-be girlfriend to the family in the covered wagon, that mother and the daughter. It was a little too obvious and simplistic to me.
No, I completely that was the other thing I was going to say that I didn't really like this surrogate mother plot. I mean, he supposedly takes the job of representing the two brothers because their mother reminds him of his own mother, Nancy Hanks. But he actually did have a stepmother,
That
and
he loved.
that he loved a very
Yeah,
good relationship with his stepmother, so he didn't need another surrogate mother. So
yeah. There was also, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it just seemed manipulative and corny, and this overly sentimental approach to female characters is typical of Ford. I mean, he's a real man. Yeah,
Yeah, and there was also a little bit of suggestion of Lincoln as an emotionally distant,
yeah,
even sexually repressed person, with his scenes with Mary Todd Lincoln, especially when they're on the veranda of the big house and Lincoln sort of staring off into the distance at the river, I think.
yeah,
And
right,
she actually comes right out and says how much she adores him, and he doesn't say a word. He
yeah.
just keeps staring ahead. That was interesting, but the movie's not really about that. And it was, I don't know. It just distracted me.
Well, I will say that when we get to the history part later, that this is actually true that Lincoln was like this, though. I mean,
Right.
he was depressive. He was melancholy a lot. He experienced a lot of life and a lot of death in his life, and he probably was distant a lot of the time. So,
Yeah.
but you're right.
Well,
I mean, it's like a biopic, but it's like, yeah, you said it earlier. It's like two separate movies. I mean, it's Lincoln the lawyer and Lincoln the neurotic.
yeah, and it was probably the most. This isn't a like or dislike, but I now have to mention it, and that is that um, what he didn't do in the movie. He, the word slavery was used once in the whole movie. This was not about Lincoln's political awakening, his sense of, social justice or injustice, the dilemmas he faced internally or equivocations, depending how you see Lincoln, in regards to the evils of slavery. It didn't cover any of that. It was totally personal qualities and his abilities as a lawyer using those personal qualities of persuasion and the humor and the like.
Yeah, I was also going to mention this myself that there was, I mean, it's an odd thing to leave out. I was also thinking, well, this is Illinois, a free state. They probably didn't have slaves there, so it didn't need to come up. But it's a kind of a big miss because if you think that Lincoln is most famous for freeing the slaves, there was no mention of it. And I assume that the reason they didn't do it is because the South, they wanted to show this movie in the South, and Lincoln's already unpopular enough down there that they didn't want to rub their noses in it. So I think this was done solely for the purposes of keeping the Southern markets viable.
But he did sneak into the movie Lincoln's love for tariffs. So and I couldn't help but think of you since we've been arguing about tariffs. And
Well, yes, yes.
and
So,
so there you go. We got Hamilton, the godfather of high tariffs, who you profess to admire, and now we've got Lincoln, whose early political career was based on high tariffs to pay for internal improvements. So I don't know, Gary. You might have to take a new, fresh look at who your heroes are.
well, this is a digression, folks. So please
Yes.
bear with me. So yeah, so he stood up in the beginning, the very beginning of the movie when he was 20 years old, which was we're talking 200 years ago at this point.
Right.
So, but he said he was in favor of protective tariffs, internal improvements,
Right. He was a Whig.
and the national bank. So internal improvements basically are what the Democrats now call infrastructure bills. And if you think about it, what's really going on here is that you have to think about politics in terms of not in terms of philosophy so much as interests. And at that point, he was representing the young, aggressive, growth-oriented, business-oriented part of America. And at that point, those people, young small businessmen, business owners, like tariffs because they didn't have to compete with England, and they like the internal improvements, and they like the bank. That
And there
that
weren't a lot
same
of it. Yeah, and there weren't a lot of alternatives because we didn't have the federal income tax.
Yeah, well, I don't think yeah, but the point is that group of people, the small businessmen, so on and so forth, they're not in favor of tariffs now, and they're not really in favor of big expensive infrastructure projects that are basically make work jobs for the unions. So
I know the situations are not historically compatible, but I just was having some fun with
yes, I know. I thought I knew we would. I was
it.
I knew that tariffs would come up. Okay, so let's get back to the movie before we drive all our listeners away. What do you think the movie was trying to accomplish?
Well, I mean, I think it's trying to build on and enhance the myths of Abraham Lincoln's personal qualities: honesty, hard work, persuasiveness, humor, sense of justice, feelings for the downtrodden, all the things that would later contribute to his leadership abilities. And I hate to do this to you, Gary, but there's actually some parallels here to another movie we've discussed, PT 109, about John F. Kennedy's exploits in World War II. Because in both movies, what they do is they show us personal qualities of Lincoln and Kennedy at earlier times in their life and leave us, the viewers who know what happened subsequently, to draw the connections between what they had in them as people and what they were able to do later as presidents.
I don't object to the idea of having a young Mr. Lincoln and a young Mr. Kennedy movie. I just think one accomplishes what it's trying to do better than the other. I would also point out that it's very everyone knows about and talks about how Hollywood's original moguls were mostly Jews who felt they needed to make pro-America movies to prove their patriotism. And one of those Jewish executives, Darryl Zanuck, was the producer of this movie. But what we forget tend to forget today is that the Irish Americans, like John Ford, were considered almost as alien as the Jews. And I think Ford is trying constantly to prove his American bona fides. Um,
Yeah.
I'll also point out,
John Sheeny,
yeah,
his real name.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Irish as you can be.
Irish as you can be. The movie was made only 75 years after the Civil War, long enough for the wounds to heal, but recent enough to be nostalgic. Lincoln was a hugely popular figure, basically a secular saint in the first half of the 20th century, and this movie sets out to capitalize on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think in it in certain ways that Ford is also trying to show some of the countries and the public shortcomings during this period. The rampant alcoholism, which was a serious, serious epidemic in the first half of this century. Um, the penchant toward mob rule, frontier justice, lynchings, and even the class snobbery of elites like William Douglas and even Mary Todd. So I think this is not all a sugary, touchy feely movie. It shows a lot of undersides of the society of the times.
But it's also, I agree with that, but I also agree that it is, in some respects, idealizing the settlement of the country, and the expansion. This is a celebration of America's expansion and frontier life. People are working hard to build America, and right in the center of this is young Abe Lincoln.
Yeah,
And you're right. They don't sugarcoat everything, but they sugarcoat slavery, and also they leave out completely the mistreatment of Indians, who were living right where this Springfield is, like as recently as 20 years ago. They've driven the
yeah.
Indians out.
Well, they more ignore it than they
Yeah,
sugarcoat
well,
it.
they don't exactly. They ignore that it even happened.
They didn't sugarcoat slavery because they didn't even mention it, but one very oblique mention.
Yeah,
And with the Indians, they had Lincoln point out at one time that he joined the militia to participate in the Black Hawk War, which was,
right.
sort of an attack on Indians.
Yeah,
And, and it's again coming back to the idea that Gone with the Wind came out in the same film. That Gone with the Wind at least dealt with slavery and the aftermath, not in ways that we find acceptable today, but it at least dealt with it. And the really bad people in Gone with the Wind um, were all whites,
well, a lot of them were Northerners.
right? And but also the Southerners that mistreated people and all that.
Yeah, all right. All right, let's talk about the actors. As I said, Henry Fonda is Abe. Um, I thought this was one of the most amazing depictions of a historical figure, that I've ever seen. And I was really surprised by it because I don't really think of Henry Fonda as being, a great actor, but I thought he really embodied Lincoln. I mean, did you agree?
Yeah, I thought he was very good. He was, of course, better looking than Abe Lincoln,
Well, yeah.
but not that Henry Fonda is that great looking. But I thought he was very good. He's kind of a sleeper kind of movie star to me. He's been in some really impressive films, but people, I don't know if he's thought of as really one of the five greats or 10 greats. He had to wait all the way till he was almost on his deathbed to win an Oscar for On Golden Pond, which was probably a sympathy Oscar more than anything else. I loved him in 12 Angry Men, much later on, and I loved him when he wanted to get away from typecasting and played the villain in Once Upon a Time in the West. Did you like him in other movies?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think he's a very capable actor, and he plays. I mean, he's had a long, long career, 30, 40 years, something like that. He's just one of these old time Hollywood stars. But in this movie, they really made him up to look like Abe Lincoln. I almost didn't recognize him as Henry Fonda. They did something to his nose. They had a wig. So we all know, we've all seen these daguerreotypes and primitive photos of Abraham Lincoln, and they made Henry Fonda up to look like that. It looked like the
Yeah,
pictures that we're familiar with. So,
it was very believable, at least as far as we know, because we're not contemporaries of Lincoln like we are with other, with current presidents.
and
But
also
it was good.
they made him look taller. I mean, they made him look so much tall. I mean, Lincoln was tall, and and Henry Fonda really embodied that. They must have had lifts of some kind to make him seem so tall, or maybe
Yeah,
they just filmed it in a certain way. But and he walked awkwardly, like Lincoln probably did. And he tells stories like Lincoln did. So I thought he was quite good.
yeah, I did too. I would note he plays in 1964. He plays a fictional president in the
Hmm.
movie Failsafe,
Right.
which maybe one day we will discuss. It's one of those 7 Days in May kind of, you
Yeah.
know, accidental nuclear Armageddon movies,
Right.
and he's very good in that too. So this is not his only chance to play someone who was or became president.
So most of the rest of the cast are supporting actors. Did any of them stand out for you?
Yeah, the other characters really weren't developed that well compared to the Lincoln character. The um, the frontier mother whose sons were on trial, I know it was played by Alice Brady, who was actually an Oscar winner. She
Yeah.
won an Oscar for in Old Chicago about Mrs. O'Leary's cow starting the big fire. This was her last film because she died of cancer a few months after the film in her 40s. So I noted her, and also William Douglas was played by Milburn Stone, who was Doc on Guns, Gunsmoke for many years. So those are the only two that stood out to me.
The only other guy that I recognized is Ward Bond. And he plays James Palmer Cass, the villain in the movie.
Yeah,
This guy was another John Ford favorite and is in more Academy Award nominated movies than any other actor. I mean, he's in Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, The Maltese Falcon, It's a Wonderful Life, The Searchers. I mean, he's been in some great movies, but he was just like one of these background guys
yeah. He was part of the stock company of Ford
and a
and
virulent anti-communist.
yeah. Gee, funny
Um,
how that works.
Yeah, funny how that works. So when you're in a bunch of movies with John Wayne and John Ford, I mean, you end up being like a little too right wing. All right. So let's turn to the history then. What did you think about the accuracy?
I thought the timeline of events in Lincoln's life, was basically okay. When he was a storekeeper, then he became a lawyer.
Mhm.
Where he lived, what he did. They slipped some factual biographical details in sort of sideways from time to time. Had him referencing that he served in the state legislature and his positions as a Whig, as we've discussed, and the rivalry with Douglas that began during this time, service in the Black Hawk War. So I thought on those details, they checked a sufficient number of boxes. Of course, probably the main timeline disconnect anyway is that the case that this was based on did not happen until the late 1850s.
Right.
And yet this was portrayed, and even then it wasn't that analogous. But Lincoln did all his legal hocus pocus in the case in the late 1850s, not in a case in the 1830s. So that was fudged. What did you
Yeah.
think?
Well, I was surprised that that case actually even happened because I thought, well, this is so Hollywood. I mean, it's obviously they've made this up to add some drama, but there was a real case. Now it wasn't exactly like this. It was only one guy, and the case was in 1858. But Lincoln actually did pull out an almanac and say that the moon was so low in the sky that it wouldn't have been enough light to see whatever happened, and he got his client off. So I thought the movie was pretty remarkably accurate to Lincoln's personality and his storytelling and his quips and self-deprecation. I you know I it to me there were some hokey things I didn't like, and the hokey Hollywood touches, like him getting his law books in a trade with the Pioneer family. In general, I thought it really it was really pretty accurate.
Yeah, probably the biggest, it's not really a complaint, it just made it a very different movie. But the biggest sin is a sin of omission. And that is that during this period, this very period the movie is covering, um, Lincoln was having a political and social conscious awakening.
Right.
And it didn't so much concern slavery as it concerned mob rule and mob justice. There were two murders, not the one portrayed in this movie, but there were two real life murders that occurred right during this time period of a newspaper editor in Illinois and a free black man in St. Louis that absolutely outraged Lincoln. And it led to one of the greatest speeches in American history, which was also during this period, his speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield in 1838, where the famous lines, let reverence for the law become the political religion of the nation, were spoken by a young Abe Lincoln. And it's just interesting to me that these things were really occupying Lincoln's attention during this very period that the movie was covering, but they were totally left out.
Well, I mean, the movie kind of does make it clear that this is a violent, and frequently lawless society where lynching was a frequent occurrence. So, I mean,
Right. It didn't ignore those issues, but there were real life things going on that a biopic of this decade could have discussed, but didn't. And it's not really even a complaint. It's just something I noted regarding the history.
I recently read a memoir by David Reynolds called Abe, which has a lot of information about this period that's covered in the movie. And the Abe in the movie is very much like the Abe in the book. The biography goes to great lengths to show that Lincoln was an intellectual titan who could hobnob with the smartest people in town, but also a remarkable physical specimen who could gain the respect of the ruffian types because of his strength. And if anything, the movie plays down his appreciation for high culture, including Shakespeare, in a way to show how he sort of empathizes with the man and emphasize he was a man of the people rather than this dichotomy that this guy Reynolds portrays.
Yeah, they sort of Ford goes up, bends over backwards to show Lincoln discomforted by high society, so to speak.
Right.
But that's sort of an American myth too that most of us kind of like. In other words, tell off the high and mighty and get down to common sense, and average people are just as good and in some ways smart or smarter than elites.
Right.
And so that's an important part of the American story. The other thing historians debate is how real this Anne Rutledge, the
Right.
would-be love of Lincoln's life, really was. She existed,
Yeah.
and she died, but historians doubt whether it was this all-powerful triggering mechanism that determined Lincoln's relationships and his qualities and his moods later on
Yeah.
throughout his life.
There's probably no one in America. I think it's true actually. There's no one in America who's had more books written about him than Abraham Lincoln, and everyone's got to come up with a new angle somewhere. So,
Yeah, yeah.
all right, let's talk about favorite scenes. What do you got?
Well, I already mentioned the first one, that sequence of brisk scenes
Yeah.
with Anne
Okay.
Rutledge, from the love affair to her death to
Yeah.
Lincoln going into law. I thought that was just so well done. Also, the scene at the doorstep of the jail,
Yeah.
where he talks the drunken mob out of the lynching and does it in a jocular, not preachy, not pompous way. I thought was really good.
That was my favorite scene. And it was repeated 25 years later in To Catch a Mockingbird when Atticus Finch similarly stops the lynching. Lincoln does it through humor and physical strength, as opposed to Atticus Finch that would probably not have succeeded in that. Do you know this movie?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
I know
you know how
exactly.
what stops the lynching isn't Finch, Atticus himself. It's his daughter who is there, and they're all and she's the one who embarrasses the people. So it's interesting that he uses the humor more than the more moralizing to get his way.
Yeah, and Lincoln is actually shown praising the lynch mob's different qualities individually as a way to then hopefully have them stand down. I thought it was very well done. Here's the thing about John Ford and scenes. Ford has this way of keeping the camera angle wide
Yeah,
and far, and there's so much you can drink in
yeah,
if you just look at the scene, whether anything's happening or not. And I just really like the camera pulled out, and then you just get to sit back and look at everything going on. And in that sense, he's almost like it's a Norman Rockwell
yeah,
kind of quality. And we're just meant to sit back and take in the world that he's created. And we especially see that in the 4th of July sequence. That whole the day, the whole
yeah,
day. And it
yeah,
was just very well done. And also well done, by the way, is how it turns from joyous and sentimental with the old timers who actually fought in the Revolutionary War,
yeah,
and then it turns really ugly
yeah.
when the lights go down and the jugs of whiskey come out and all that. So I really like that. It's hard not to like John Ford scenes because of the scenery.
Yeah, no. I mean, he's not considered one of America's greatest directors for nothing. Another scene that I liked is after the trial, when the family's leaving. It's like 2 minutes left in the movie. He allows the family to pay him a fee. You think at first he'll say no, since they're so poor, don't give me any money. But he understands that it would hurt their pride to take charity.
Yeah,
So it's a very subtle thing. Like, yeah, I'll take your money.
yeah, that was
It's where,
good.
because I respect you enough to know that I provided a service and and that,
Yeah,
yeah.
I thought that was great. I like the whole courtroom
Well, yeah.
set piece just because it's so entertaining. And it just, it was all, some of it was ridiculous. And I don't know if, even in those days, if a lawyer like Lincoln would have his feet up on his desk, while the trial's going on. But I mean, it was so entertaining. And then I have to say, I don't know about you, but I just got choked up at the very end, the last scene in the
Okay.
movie where he's walking up the hill and there are ominous sounds of thunder and cannons in the background. And then then it changes from Lincoln standing alone on the top of the hill to a shot of the statue in the Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very, very emotional, good, spare, but powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's like the whole movie is foreshadowing the
Right.
presidency.
And Ford doesn't have to say a word because he knows we all know,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Okay. Favorite lines?
Well, during the getting the mob to stand down at the
Yeah. Yeah.
lynching, don't hang him and deprive me of my first case. It's just he was like, hey, I got a fee coming here. Don't, like, and then also in the same scene, we do things together we'd be mighty ashamed to do by ourselves, which is a good, you know, analysis of mob
Right.
rule. Maybe something people should remember when they're doing all this crap on social media.
One of my favorite lines also is in that same two, where he says, "Trouble is when people start taking the law into their own hands, they're just as apt in all the confusion and fun to start hanging somebody who's not a murderer as someone who is. Then the next thing you know, they're hanging one another just for fun till it gets to the place a man can't pass a tree or look at a rope without feeling uneasy. You know,
Yeah,
so
that
he's
was good.
using logic, irony, and dry wit to stop the lynching instead of an appeal to the morality. This
Right,
whole thing about like, don't kill this guy, don't kill my clients because I need the fee. He's not putting himself above them morally,
right,
right?
right.
He's like saying, like, hey, I'm just like you. You're screwing me over if you kill these guys.
And you shouldn't do this because it could happen to you someday.
And it
So
could,
it's in
yeah,
your self-interest.
yeah,
It's in your selfish interest
yeah,
not to lynch somebody. Um, I like the line during the hilarious line during the court scene where he's up against a really pompous
right.
prosecutor, and they're in voir dire, so they're trying to determine prejudices or conflicts of interest of the various jurors. And Lincoln starts asking all the prospective jurors, do you know the prosecutor? And the prosecutor objects, and he says, "Oh, I'm just doing this because I'm afraid some of the jurors might not know you, and that would put me at a great disadvantage." It was just hilarious.
Yeah, well, also during the trial, the judge says when they're like very raucous, he says, "Come, come, gentlemen, calm down. You've got to give the boys a fair trial, a jury trial, before you can hang them."
Right. And there was so much funny stuff in the courtroom scene.
Yeah,
The one of the witness, Jack Cass,
yeah,
and Lincoln started running his two names together. So, Mr. Jackass,
yeah.
Jackass. And then at some point, finally, the judge, who was snoozing, says, "Jackass, I got it. I finally got it," and starts belly laughing. Very, very entertaining.
Very entertaining. Yeah, there was one serious line that I thought when he was reading the law book. He says, "Law, the rights of persons and the rights of things, the rights of life, reputation, and liberty, the rights to acquire and hold property. Wrong's a violation of those rights. By jing, that's all there is to it, right or wrong. You know,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
reducing the law to something that we can all understand.
Yeah. Maybe that was a good way to do this film instead of the more stately lines that I remember from his Young Men's Lyceum speech taking place around the same time.
Yeah.
It's same point, really. I think we had to read that speech, by the way, in Poli Sci 102, if I'm not mistaken, with Murray Drive, 50 years ago almost.
I did not
Um,
take that class. I was in your poli
oh,
sci 101 class, not
and then
101.
you had enough after
I
that.
think I had had enough.
You went to Mr. Thurber's American President's class where it was automatic A, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
easy A.
yeah. All right. What do we think about the relevance or comparisons to politics and society today?
The connections are there if you want to see them, but they're indirect mostly. He touches on the issues of mob violence,
Yeah,
mob rule, elites versus working class, and even addiction, which is a big issue today.
yeah, yeah.
On politics, he probably makes us yearn because he shows how the qualities of persuasion, argumentation, humor, humility, relatability, and empathy can be really important to politics and important to governance, which we don't have so much of today.
Right. I would also say that that what we see in this movie is a mobile society where you can rise or fall in wealth, status, and class based on your talent and ability. A guy like Lincoln, born desperately poor with only 1 year of formal education, could become a successful lawyer because there were no barriers to advancement. This is a big problem now.
Yeah.
Big change from where we were even when we were growing up, and certainly a big change from when this movie was made.
Well, the obsession with credentialism
Right,
now,
right,
and a lot of it isn't worth the paper it's printed on,
right.
in terms of performance. But yeah, that's a good point. In fact, I sat in this movie, watching this movie, astounded that this guy would be president in 20 years or so,
Right.
because he really did come from such nothing.
He was
And it's
probably,
a reminder that that can happen in America, and it still can. It still can.
yeah. Um, Yeah, I mean, Lincoln was probably the poorest, came from the poorest part of society of all the other presidents.
Right, right.
Do you think this movie could be made today?
I think they could make a movie about a Mr. Lincoln, but it would be a different movie. It
Yeah,
would not be nearly as hagiographic.
right.
It would delve much more into his political activism, the good parts and the moral equivocations about slavery, because, as we know, he was far from a purist abolitionist, far from one. So I think
Yeah,
it
I
would be a
mean,
very mixed bag now, but they could do it.
yeah. I think we actually need to qualify this category a little bit to say that it's obvious that anything could be made somewhere on a streaming service.
Yeah.
But the question really is regarding major releases.
And what it would include.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Steven Spielberg movie, Lincoln came out a dozen years ago, so there was a market for Lincoln movies then. But I think the only way a movie about Lincoln's young adulthood could be made now if a major director took an interest in it, because it's hard to get any movies made. And I think you're right. I think you're really right about this, that if they did make it, they would probably harp a little bit on how Lincoln was more of a pragmatist than an idealist. And he wanted to get rid of slavery incrementally rather than trying to just rip it out root and branch, which was
Yeah.
not feasible without
Right.
violence, which is what we ended up with.
And by the way, as much as I admire Lincoln, I wouldn't mind a movie about that if it was fair.
Yeah,
A movie that really showed what he said when and what about all these issues.
yep,
Yeah, that would
yep.
be interesting as
I,
a younger person.
if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
I would. And I think it would be a good jumping off place to more serious study. But here's the problem. I think the kids would be bored by it
Yeah.
and they wouldn't like it because it's in black and white and it's so old fashioned.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly. I mean, I would say I would not assign it just for that very reason. The cinematic language of 1939 seems so outdated today, especially for teens raised on TikTok. And also, to be honest with you, the message of the movie is very subtle and not very obvious. It's no big political issues to discuss. It's just a character study. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure what they would take away from this movie, but I mean, and I think it's too bad that kids can't don't have the patience to watch movies like this anymore.
Yeah.
All right, how would you grade it?
A minus. I thought it was a very good movie. And I think it's very, very much worth seeing. And by the way, folks, it is absolutely free to watch on YouTube.
That's right.
So when you go to YouTube, you can watch the movie and then you can go to Celluloid President page on YouTube and re-listen to this podcast. And I think you'll get a full picture.
I
Plug,
didn't.
plug, plug.
I like the movie. I didn't like it as much as you did. I would give it a B. I like John. Much prefer Stagecoach, for example, which is a great action movie made the same year. It was a little too stagey and a little old fashioned for me,
Mm-hmm.
but definitely worth watching. And as you said, I mean, definitely go to YouTube and watch the movie after for free after our
Well, I
discussion.
never thought I would grade a Lincoln movie higher than you. So, but we did it. I graded Nix. I understand that I grade Nixon movies higher than you, JFK movies higher than you, but Lincoln, I thought you'd always outgrade me.
No, I mean, again, I'm great. I'm not grading. Grading a little bit on a curve because I know John Ford is. There's so many other John Ford movies that I like more. Put it that way. All right. So in closing, this podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there. And as Jim also already said, it's available on YouTube. If you have comments, you can email me at garyholmes76@gmail.com. Looking ahead, we plan to discuss the next time we plan to discuss Complete Unknown, the biopic of Bob Dylan that is currently in the theaters. I've seen it, and it has a number of interesting things to say about the early 1960s. And there is a president who's shown on a television there. So I think we can justifiably say that there is a presidential equivalent there. So
That's right.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
We're not going to record until after the Oscars because I'm hoping that there's actually I'm kind of hoping that Complete Unknown wins the Academy Award. So, all
That's
right.
fine with me. Have a great Lincoln's birthday.
Yeah, you too.
And hide your pennies.
And go out and buy a mattress. Bye bye.
Get away, Lincoln. We're coming through.
All joking aside, let's look at this matter from my side. Why, you all know I'm just a fresh lawyer trying to get ahead. But some of you boys act like you want to do me out of my first clients. I'm not saying you fellas are not right. Maybe these boys do deserve to hang. But with me handling their case, don't look like you'll have much to worry about on that score. All I'm asking is to have it done with some legal pomp and show.
That's all right. Around our side of it. We've gone to a heap of trouble not to have at least one hanging.
Sure you have, Mac. And if these boys had more than one life, I'd say go ahead. Maybe a little hanging mightn't do them any harm. But the sort of hanging you boys would give them would be so permanent. Trouble is, when men start taking the law into their own hands, they're just zapped in all the confusion and fun to start hanging somebody who's not a murderer as somebody who is. And the next thing you know, they're hanging one another just for fun. Till it gets to a place a man can't pass a tree or look at a rope without feeling uneasy.